There has been a strategic development on the front. The Russians have been disconnected from Starlink in the last 24 hours, and that changes everything. I spoke with French soldiers in the Ukrainian army who say fighting has decreased. Russian artillery is less accurate and they lack drones. I wanted to explain this first. Starlink, of course, is that network of thousands of communication satellites launched by Elon Musk with SpaceX. They offer good bandwidth and are accessible absolutely everywhere. And at the beginning of the war, Elon Musk urgently activated the service over Ukraine, sending thousands of terminals. And Starlink really became the backbone of the Ukrainian army, knowing that radio communications don't get through because of jamming. The Ukrainian army is now the world's most connected, surpassing the United States. And all elements of modern warfare are carried out with internet communication that necessarily goes through Starlink in Ukraine, for now. For example, communication between command posts and units on the ground. For a team on the front line that needs ammunition or food, this is how they inform. And conversely, it's through the internet that the men holding the front are warned that a future Russian assault is being prepared, or if Russian reconnaissance drones are nearby, preventing their operations. Like what you can see here in this video, where every soldier on the front can have complete visibility of what's happening around him. Considering the presence of Russian FPVs and reconnaissance drones, it's clear when reconnaissance drones are involved. They can't go out to resupply or to launch drones, for example, because it's too dangerous. Then we also have the flow of information back to headquarters, including for the sensors that are deployed on the front, like radars, acoustic detectors, electronic warfare systems that allow you to see the missiles and hear the shaheds coming. We also have real-time video and image feeds for coordinating operations. For example, so that a drone can designate its target to an artillery unit. And here, these are images I shot in the Anna of Kiev brigade. I was on position with the Caesar cannons. And you can see that they also use WhatsApp and Signal at headquarters for their information exchanges. And also that all the headquarters operate with a kind of Google Meet, with information from the front lines coming directly up on these screens. Then there's the whole information technology aspect, where all the map updates happen, for example. Before going to the front, I saw this in the 3rd Brigade. They have software called Kropiva to get the enemy's position before launching an assault. For example, to gather intelligence on a trench, all the information is downloaded via Starlink. In the same way, the electronic warfare software updates for the systems on the front line or for the large drones. There's a video coming out soon from the Sivers area. I was with them. The downloading of drone update information is also done via Starlink. It's absolutely essential. There's also the morale aspect. For example, I'm currently about 15 kilometers from the front, and everyone has internet access, even in their bunkers. It also helps them hold on psychologically by allowing them to always stay in touch with their families, or simply watch movies to pass the time. So you have to understand that aside from this tactical and operational aspect on the front, there's also a strategic value and a Starlink that's increasingly being installed on mobile devices as well to turn it directly into a weapon, or rather to improve existing weapons. The first example, of course, was the naval drones, and these are the drones that are piloted by Starlink over hundreds and hundreds of kilometers, which made it possible to win the Battle of the Black Sea by guiding dozens of jet skis packed with explosives against Russian ships. Then the Ukrainians greatly improved what was at first a kind of makeshift system, but overall it became a strategic asset for the Ukrainians. The Russians had to barricade themselves in Novorossiysk's port similarly. In Kramatorsk, I also showed you similar ground robots. It has a 12.7 caliber machine gun, and it carries a jammer to prevent Russian communications from reaching the drones. All of this will be operated from the other side of Ukraine using Starlink and the roof antenna. And also, since the end of 2024, the Ukrainians have increasingly installed Starlink on board their kamikaze drones carried here. We're talking about FP-1 Firepoint drones, which have had a lot of success, as we can see against these planes that are based on the ground. But Starlink also has such a high data rate and acceptable latency that it's even possible to attack helicopters in flight. They fly dozens of kilometers behind the front lines at very low altitude, making them impossible to detect or shoot down with conventional air defense systems. On the other hand, obviously, Starlink has its limits. First, it depends on the goodwill of Elon Musk. Remember? He boasted in 2023 about having prevented a Russian Pearl Harbor, meaning he had cut off Starlink, to be able to stop dozens of naval drones that were heading toward the ships in the port of Sevastopol. And by preventing this attack, obviously he stopped the destruction of the Black Sea Fleet, which today continues to fire missiles at civilians. Elon Musk has blood on his hands for allowing his Russian ships to keep bombing civilians for more than 3 years now. The same thing at the same time. End of 2022, When the Ukrainians were succeeding in their major counteroffensive, they liberated 20,000 square kilometers, the Kherson areas, the Kupchansk areas. We now know that Elon Musk was afraid that the Ukrainians would be too effective, so he simply shut down the system in the areas that were being reconquered, and to prevent the Ukrainian army's effectiveness from relying on Elon Musk's goodwill. Obviously, it's the United States Department of Defense and the military that have taken over Starlink. Then the second limitation is that the service is inaccessible in Russia, but it works in Ukraine, including in occupied Ukraine. And that's why, starting in 2024, the Russians will begin to copy the Ukrainians in using Starlink terminals, because they will manage to buy them in large quantities through smuggling via Kazakhstan, Turkey, the Emirates, and then they simply pay for subscriptions with foreign bank cards, especially European ones, to go unnoticed. And that allowed the Russian army to copy the good Ukrainian tactics. They're now more effective in targeting and all that. Obviously, it gives an equalizing power, but there's another problem, which is that the Ukrainians, when they use Starlink, for example, on missiles, they can only use it over Ukraine and occupied Ukraine, so that's Crimea, with a lot of effectiveness. But on the other hand, for the Russians, when they start, from the end of 2025, to also install Starlink on missiles, they can reach all of Ukraine, all the way to the end of the country. And there, obviously, that gives the Russians an advantage, whereas until now, the Ukrainians were still able to relatively easily intercept Russian drones, for example, with Sting interceptors. But the problem is when there's Starlink on board a kamikaze drone, for example. Shot, it no longer has to fly at several hundred meters of altitude, where it is easily identified, detected, and destroyed. They'll be able to pilot it in real time, following the terrain, flying very low, and therefore being less visible to radar. And then, the second point is that when you arrive at an airport, if you launched your Shahed at an airport thinking there might be planes in certain locations, between the time you take the satellite photo, send the Shahed, and it arrives 6, 8, or 10 hours later, those planes may have moved. But when you're able to pilot the Shahed all the way to impact, what we saw with the Ukrainian images, well, it allows the Russians to target and have effective strikes, for example, to destroy helicopters. We can see that they also destroyed mock-ups, fake F-16s that the Ukrainians placed in certain locations around the country to make the Russians waste ammunition. But overall, it meant that the Russians had this capability. And then they also used Shahed drones with Starlink to target passenger trains while they were still moving. Or they were able to bypass the air defenses that were around a power plant in order to strike it. In this winter war that the Russians are trying to wage against the Ukrainian population, so there was a real problem there. And in Ukraine, there was also a change of the Minister of Defense, who was actually the former Minister of Digital Innovation. He contacted Elon Musk stating there was a problem that urgently needed a solution. And it was very quick, since all the Starlink units moving at more than 75 km/h were simply deactivated. That means the Russian missiles no longer worked, but the problem was that the Ukrainian missiles also no longer worked. So it was an equalizing system. And then, in the end, they found a solution in less than 3 days, which was to set up a whitelist. Starlink terminals have a unique serial number, and the Ukrainian Ministry of Defense, in cooperation with Starlink, set up a website where all Ukrainian Starlink operators can simply register their Starlink as officially belonging to the Ukrainian army, and in just 3 days, all Russian Starlinks were deactivated. And I already have feedback from French-speaking fighters who are engaged on the Ukrainian front in the Ukrainian army, and who are already telling me today that the Russian army has lost effectiveness. For example, logistics can go more smoothly, since in the past, as soon as a car or a ground drone brought in equipment, it was very quickly targeted by kamikaze drones. Since when it was detected by a large observation drone via Starlink, the information was provided to the teams who would launch the first-person view kamikaze drones. They each have small hideouts where they stay, so they're not all together in one big bunker. And so, logically, since the Russians no longer have information about the arrival of supply vehicles that are going to move, they no longer launch the FPVs. Russian artillery is less accurate. And then, apparently, there are initial attempts, small assaults, small raids on positions to gather intelligence, to take prisoners, to recover equipment. Well, the Russians weren't aware that there was a Ukrainian assault coming in the form of a small raid. It was in the Izium area where I was told this, so that means the front is changing, and it's changing in favor of the Ukrainians. From a strategic point of view, this could have a global effect since there was this alignment between the two armies that were connected. And overnight, the Russian army no longer has this advantage and goes back to the level of the Russian army in 2022, And so we have many Russian soldiers sharing messages on social media from their Starlings who refuse to let them connect. There is the command that clearly says it is disorganized, like the openly neo-Nazi unit called Rusich, whose leaders complain about having to go to the front line with drone operators in order to have visibility on the front line, while Russian soldiers are even making appeals to the public to help them find alternatives. Except that launching hundreds and hundreds of satellites like Elon Musk obviously doesn't happen overnight. There is no Russian or Chinese alternative that could replace Starlink. There are projects, there are ambitions, but for now it's absolutely not operational like Starlink could be. Or the European alternative called OneWeb Hotelsat, which hasn't been deployed as much yet but is already still the second largest network, which had been used once by the Ukrainians during the offensive in Kursk when they deployed resources. Starlink didn't work in Kursk because it was on Russian territory, so they used Hotelsat, OneWeb. But it's a little less dense, a little less efficient for now. In a few years, they'll have exactly the same level as Starlink, but for now it's Starlink and possibly OneWeb. But on the other hand, there's nothing for the Russians and the Chinese. And today, they're really stuck and really on the front lines. It changes everything, to the point that some people tell me, but the Russians will have to accept a ceasefire now because they can't afford to be blind, not being able to have the same level of effectiveness as artillery. On the Ukrainian side, it's a real strategic advantage, so we also need to ask the question for our own armies. If we ever face an army that has this total connectivity everywhere, on every unit, on every soldier, and we don't have it, that's going to be a real problem. What can the Russians do? They haven't managed to target, jam, or stop Starlink from working since the beginning. Despite cyber attacks and attempts to target the Starlink network, it connects directly to the satellites. A bit like laser beams, it's not going to broadcast everywhere like a radio or a radar. This means that the signal itself is still difficult to detect, so you can't pinpoint where, for example, the enemies are going to be this way. So destroying them doesn't work, blocking them doesn't work either, so there's another option, and that's the Russians. This was revealed a few months ago by Western intelligence services. They developed a kind of satellite that released tens of thousands of steel balls that would go in all directions and would eventually lead to the destruction of the Starlink network. Until now, since the Russians were using it themselves, obviously they haven't used this method. Now we might ask, would they want to destroy the entire Starlink network? At first glance, this destruction, from the moment this rocket is launched with its space shrapnel, it could lead to the destruction of low-altitude communication networks like Starlink in just a few months. That's because once you destroy a satellite, it creates a lot of debris, a bit like we saw back in the day when the Chinese and the Americans made a show of force by destroying just one satellite. Now, with thousands of satellites, if you have a few hundred that break, obviously, that then creates a snowball effect and ends up destroying the whole constellation. So today, there's a fear that the Russians might destroy Starlink in this way, because obviously there's also a vulnerability in space, simply so that the Ukrainians would be brought down to the level of the Russians, who are currently not connected. Here you go. I hope you enjoyed the video. This was a direct field analysis. Thanks for supporting and helping the team on the ground. They appreciate your backing. Here, for example, a French operator holds a drone detector and sees the Russian drone's image, letting him know if he's being targeted. Overall, the guys will keep fighting. The war isn't over, and we need to be clear about that. We have high hopes that this could speed up a Russian willingness to give up or stop losing men for nothing. But we're still very far from that today. The pressure must continue. All right, I hope you enjoyed it, and I'll see you very soon.